The water level of China's famous Yangtze River has risen so much that it's now 16 feet higher than Wuhan city's ground level. It's the highest recorded peak in the last 20 years. Flooding continues to ravage southern China, while many are forced to flee their homes. But one state media host says the disaster is just an illusion. The Trump administration may soon end an agreement with Chinese auditing authorities. The move may indicate a broader crackdown on U.S.-listed Chinese firms that don't abide by U.S. standards. China says it will impose unspecified sanctions on 3 U.S. lawmakers and 1 ambassador, but experts say the impact will likely be minimal. And China and Iran are reportedly close to signing a major economic and military deal, though it may create more friction between the U.S. and China. An expert says the 2 regimes are working together against the U.S. and that the move could be aimed at the upcoming November election. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. The water level of China's famous Yangtze River has risen to 16 feet higher than Wuhan city's ground level. It's the highest recorded level in the last 20 years. The water of the Yangtze River flows along the embankment in Wuhan and rushes towards the retaining wall. Sometimes people climb the wall to look across to the other side of the river. Now, locals say the water is so close that it makes passing ships look bigger than usual. A recent update revealed the water level in Wuhan Pass along the Yangtze River is now more than 90 feet above sea level. That's only 3 feet away from breaking the area's record. On one of the embankment's retainer walls, there's a plaque engraved with 3 important water levels for Wuhan Pass. One social media user commented that the water level marker for the area's major flood of 1998 is now submerged. Other pictures capture the situation on the small island along the Yangtze River. The flooding there is so high that only treetops can be seen poking out from the water. Regions in southern China are struggling more and more as heavy rain continues. But one host from a state-run media outlet says the serious flooding is just an illusion. NTD's Juliet Song has the story.
Heavy rain is still battering China and the flooding is getting worse. It's already destroyed millions of homes. But one Chinese TV host from a state-run broadcaster has other ideas. She says the flooding is merely an illusion.
Why is the flooding seemingly getting worse despite the many dams that have been built? It's because the internet has become so convenient, feeding information about the flooding to your cell phones non-stop. It creates the illusion that the flooding is getting worse.
Online, one comment left by a user was upvoted over 1,000 times. In a sarcastic tone, it reads, "So, it's all the internet's fault. If the world only has TV and no internet, with a host like this, won't it just be a peaceful world for everyone?" The comment comes as locals in some regions continue to suffer.
The water is going into my house. It's going into my house. Sound the alarm. Sound the alarm.
In the southeastern province of Anhui, the water level of nearly 30 rivers have risen above the warning level. Some embankments have also burst or are on the brink of collapse.
This flood is almost as bad as the one in 1998, and the water is still rising. The situation is pretty dire.
Another major flood back in 1998 was the worst in recent decades. But this year's flooding is no less serious. In Anhui, over 2 million people have already been impacted by the disaster. Many of them have been forced to abandon their homes. Another nearby province, Jiangxi, is among the worst hit in China. Locals are now grappling with flood control. Videos circulating online show residents being urged to evacuate as soon as possible.
The water level is expected to rise up to 95 feet above sea level. The flood control is in a dire situation. To make sure that you and your possessions are safe, everyone please clean up your belongings and seek help from friends and family.
But in another city, a resident told us that no one in his area has evacuated. To protect his identity, we gave him a pseudonym and distorted his voice.
The flooding is really bad here, but the government is not organizing evacuations.
He said some locals are now homeless with no food to eat, and that there isn't enough space in shelters to go around.
Many people are now trapped. The situation is urgent.
One internet user posted a video on Twitter explaining that some of the newly homeless people have fled to a nearby mountain area. Chen Han and Juliet Song, NTD News.
Severe flooding has been pushing up pork prices in China. They've been on the rise for 6 weeks in a row and are now 15% higher than normal. According to July 9th data from the CCP Census Bureau, pork prices in China rose over 80% year-on-year in June. In north and central China, it nearly doubled. Even before the floods, China's pig population decreased by nearly 200 million last year due to African swine fever. The loss was equivalent to 40% of all live pigs in China. Now to Hong Kong. China has declared Hong Kong's pro-democracy election illegal. The city's leader has announced an investigation saying the city's primary elections that were held over the weekend might violate the new national security law. The law came into effect on June 30th. It criminalizes anything Beijing deems subversion or secession and comes with a maximum penalty of life in prison. Critics call it a crackdown of the city's autonomy and freedom. The primaries were held by Hong Kong's pro-democratic parties. Around 600,000 people voted for Democratic candidates. The city's pro-democracy parties have made similar efforts before, but this was the most organized yet. Half of the 70 seats in Hong Kong's legislature are decided by direct election. The other half are picked from businesses and social constituencies. The city's formal elections are scheduled for September. Beijing singled out legal academic Benny Tai in its statement on Monday. Mr. Tai was one of the organizers for the weekend's primaries. China accuses Tai of seizing the governance of Hong Kong and deliberately trying to stage a revolution. Democratic candidates may win official legislative seats, but a number of pro-democracy candidates were disqualified in the last election 4 years ago. Now we look to U.S.-Hong Kong relations. The U.S. is taking another step towards holding Chinese Communist Party members accountable for their actions against Hong Kong.
The Hong Kong Autonomy Act, which I signed this afternoon, passed unanimously through Congress. This law gives my administration powerful new tools to hold responsible the individuals and the entities involved in extinguishing Hong Kong's freedom. We've all watched what happened. Not a good situation.
President Trump also said that he signed an executive order that ends preferential treatment for Hong Kong. That means Hong Kong will be treated the same as mainland China. No more special economic status and no more sensitive U.S. technology exports to the city. Trump's orders comes after the Chinese regime established its overreaching national security law. The U.S. is planning to suspend its extradition treaty with Hong Kong. Former U.S. officials and congressional aides told Foreign Policy magazine that the pending decision could be made within weeks. Australia and Canada have already suspended their treaties to Hong Kong. Extradition treaties are normally based on trust between two countries' legal systems. But due to Beijing's new law on Hong Kong, many Western countries now see Hong Kong's trusted legal system as a thing of the past. Germany's Green Party has called on the government to end an extradition agreement with Hong Kong. The German government has not responded. The country's leaders criticized Beijing's imposing of the new Hong Kong law. German President Frank-Walter Steinmeier said implementing the law will cause a sustainable negative change to the European and Western countries. Similarly, Chancellor Angela Merkel has called the new law a worrying development. German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas also says the one country, two systems principle must not be undermined. The State Department says China is using threats and coercion to advance its interest in the South China Sea. An official said the U.S. military involvement in the region is not provocative. Instead, it is to uphold international law.
The State Department said the Chinese regime is advancing a might makes right campaign in the South China Sea. An official said Beijing is trying to control the region. He said Beijing is denying international law while using threats and coercion to dominate the area.
In recent months, Beijing has sunk Vietnamese fishing vessels. It sent an armed flotilla to harass Malaysian offshore energy exploration and wielded maritime militia to surround Philippine outposts. Beijing has further militarized its artificial islands in the Spratlys with new aircraft deployments. It has announced unilateral fishing bans It has conducted destabilizing military exercises in the contested waters around these disputed features.
The official said Beijing increasingly uses man-made islands as a military base. It launches harassment operations to block Southeast Asian countries from gaining resources like oil, gas, and fish. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations is called ASEAN. This includes the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam, among others. A Filipino analyst says ASEAN should work to curb China's military presence in the sea before working on an agreement.
What we need is a freeze on further militarization, on further aggressive naval exercises, on further provocative action by paramilitary forces, militia forces. I think that is what the ASEAN should really focus on. Freezing the situation first before we can properly talking about the rules of the road or even ambitiously illegally binding code of conduct. So I think it's impossible.
The director at a Vietnamese research institute says there is concern China is taking advantage of the pandemic to advance its agenda.
And a major concern has been that China would be taking advantage of the vulnerability of countries in the region in the fight against COVID-19 to push ahead with its assertiveness and its presence in the South China Sea.
He says that concern is furthered by the fear that the Chinese regime is expanding its influence around its periphery. This is evidenced by Beijing's encroachment on Hong Kong, its conflict at the Indian border, and its assertiveness in the South China Sea. Kevin Hogan, NTD News.
China is planning to sanction an American weapons company for its involvement in arms sales to Taiwan. The move could escalate tensions between China and the U.S. Taiwan is a self-ruling island with its own democratic system, but China has vowed to unify it with the mainland, threatening eventual force. Last week, the U.S. approved an over $600 million deal with Taiwan. The agreement will upgrade Taiwan's surface-to-air Patriot missiles. One of the sale's main contractors is Lockheed Martin, one of the largest players in both the aerospace and arms industries. Beijing didn't give details about how it will sanction the company. The penalties could target Lockheed Martin's Chinese suppliers. According to a report from Sky News, the core technique for Lockheed Martin's F-35 jets comes from the U.S., but a Chinese-owned company manufactures circuit boards for them. Now we turn to the East China Sea. Japan is accusing China of pushing the territorial claims in the region. The country also says the Chinese regime is spreading disinformation and propaganda as it provides medical aid to nations fighting the pandemic. In its annual defense review, Japan asserted that China is attempting to alter the status quo by coercion surrounding the Senkaku Islands. It added that China has made relentless intrusions in those waters. The Senkaku Islands are known as Diaoyudao in China. Both nations claim the area as their own. And from the UK, new military cooperation is announced with the US and Japan. According to newspaper The Times, Britain's new aircraft carrier, the HMS Queen Elizabeth, will join the US and Japan's joint military exercises in the Far East next year. 2 squadrons, stealth combat jets, likely to be a mix of Royal Air Force and US Marine Corps aircraft, will participate. The move is meant to counter an increasingly assertive China. A senior official says the Trump administration will soon end an agreement between U.S. and Chinese auditing authorities. The move may indicate a broader crackdown on U.S.-listed Chinese firms that fail to comply with U.S. standards.
A senior State Department official says the Trump administration plans to end a 2013 audit deal that laid the groundwork for Chinese listings in the U.S. The deal set up a process for a U.S. auditing watchdog to get documents in enforcement cases against Chinese auditors. But the watchdog has long complained about China's failure to grant requests. And in March, Beijing banned Chinese people from sharing securities-related documents with regulators overseas without state approval. The lack of transparency may have prompted U.S. officials' plans to exit the deal. Ending the agreement requires a 30-day notice. The termination would not directly threaten the listed status of Chinese companies trading on U.S. exchanges. Pressure is also mounting in Congress. The Senate passed a bill that would prevent any foreign company from being listed on U.S. exchanges if it failed to comply with U.S. audits for 3 years in a row. Some U.S. investors say this could shut them out of investment opportunities available to investors in other countries. The bill would have to be approved in the House and signed by the president to become law.
Beijing said it will impose sanctions on U.S. officials in response to actions taken by the U.S., but experts say the impact will likely be minimal. The U.S. imposed sanctions against top Chinese officials over human rights violations in Xinjiang.
Beijing announced what it is calling corresponding sanctions against U.S. officials, including 2 senators, Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz. It comes in retaliation for sanction measures against Chinese officials that involves freezing their U.S. assets and travel bans. The U.S. imposed sanctions on top Chinese officials for human rights violations targeting minority Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. But experts say Beijing's sanctions on U.S. lawmakers will have little impact.
These U.S. lawmakers do not have any assets in China, so the sanction is almost unenforceable against them.
Whereas a large portion of Chinese officials' financial assets are based in the U.S.
There is a strong desire among Chinese communist officials to use the United States as a place to keep stolen funds, which isn't the case among U.S. lawmakers with China. This results in a severe disparity between the two sides in terms of sanctions.
The Chinese Communist Party's treatment of Muslim Uyghurs in the Xinjiang region has drawn international condemnation. More than 1 million ethnic Uyghurs and Muslims are held in detention centers in Xinjiang.
The U.S. sanctions are justified because there is solid evidence that these sanctioned officials are directly responsible for the concentration camps and mass extermination crimes in Xinjiang. But the CCP has no way of using these Americans' concerns about religious freedom and human rights in China to justify its sanctions.
Chinese sanctions will also be applied to a U.S. agency that monitors human rights in China. Senator Rubio is co-chairman. Rubio had made light of the sanctions on Twitter, asking, quote, "I guess they don't like me." Senator Cruz, also on Twitter, commented that the Chinese regime was, quote, "terrified and lashing out."
The Chinese Communist Party has no means of sanctioning U.S. officials other than banning them from entering the country.
The sanctions come as China-U.S. relations have sunk to new lows amid the CCP virus pandemic.
China and Iran are reportedly close to signing an economic and security deal of massive scale. It would potentially create more friction between the U.S. and China. And experts say the two regimes are working together against the U.S. and that the move could be aimed at the U.S. election.
Citing a draft of the deal, the New York Times reported that if the agreement is signed, China would be building railroads, ports, and telecommunications in Iran, in exchange for discounted Iranian oil for the next 25 years. The deal also includes a military partnership and intelligence sharing. In 2018, the Trump administration pulled out of the Iranian nuclear deal made by President Obama. It also restarted crippling sanctions on Iran's oil, finance, and tech industries, and banned countries and companies from trading with Iran. China remained Iran's top trade partner and has been among its top 3 arms suppliers in the past decade. The U.S. had also punished several Chinese individuals and companies, including tech giants Huawei and ZTE, for trading with Iran in violation of U.S. sanctions. Joseph Bosco is a former China country director at the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He said the recent deal is just one more example of China's decision to undermine U.S. sanctions.
Their philosophy is, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Since they're both suffering from what the U.S. is doing in the area of sanctions, they're collaborating to, A, to ease the sanctions against Iran, and B, to help China economically with the special oil deal.
He said the deal came at a time when China's geopolitical influence has been on the defensive. The regime's cover-up of the virus, as well as its aggression over Hong Kong and the South China Sea, have drawn criticism from both the U.S. and other democracies.
So all these things are beginning to add up, and China is accumulating a lot of hostile feelings in the rest of the world. So this is a way of China, in effect, saying, we don't have many friends. We better make a deal with somebody that doesn't hate us the way the rest of the world does.
The Iran nuclear deal was considered one of President Obama's major political legacies, but President Trump called the deal defective at its core and accused Iran of continuing to develop weapons and sponsor terrorism.
We have definitive proof that this Iranian promise was a lie. After the sanctions were lifted, the dictatorship used its new funds to build nuclear-capable missiles, support terrorism, and cause havoc throughout the Middle East and beyond.
By reimposing U.S. sanctions, Trump has drawn criticism both domestically and from the EU, which can no longer benefit from trading with Iran for fear of U.S. penalties. Bosco said the coming U.S. election could be a factor in why China is pushing for the deal right now.
I believe strongly that neither Iran nor China want Trump to be reelected. So they're doing this. One of the other benefits of this deal is politically to hurt the Trump administration and to salvage Iran's economic situation and to help China as well. And all of that will theoretically hurt Trump and then help his opposition.
The fate of the deal is complicated by the internal debate in Iran, as the regime's leader Hussein Rouhani is facing criticism over his handling of the pandemic, which originates from China. Penny Zhou, NTD News.
One of the world's largest pension funds has invested in a leading Chinese tech company. But internet censorship and human rights issues involving the Chinese company is raising concerns about whether the investment is justified.
A Canada Pension Plan Investment Board has invested around $300 million in leading Chinese tech company Tencent. The investment has remained active since it was made in 2016, but evidence warns that the Chinese regime likely uses Tencent social media app WeChat to enforce censorship in China. According to Canadian media outlet iPolitics last year, the Canadian House of Commons cybersecurity team warned its members and staff to stay away from WeChat, often considered China's Twitter. A report from the University of Toronto Citizen Lab said WeChat communications, both inside and outside China, are subject to pervasive content surveillance. It added that the information obtained is used to tighten censorship on content that the regime deems sensitive. There are also cases of Chinese authorities using private WeChat messages to track down targets, even by using deleted messages. In 2018, authorities posted online that they had retrieved deleted messages from a suspect's WeChat and made breakthrough in the case. That indicates police and other authorities can access even deleted WeChat messages, something in line with the Canadian cybersecurity warning. A report released last year by Washington-based nonprofit Freedom House said official surveillance of WeChat also has legal consequences for its users. For example, if a user posts about human rights abuses, including the persecution of Tibetans, Falun Gong practitioners, or other spiritual or ethnic minorities, the user may face punishment. That can range from days of administrative detention to years in prison. The Assistant U.S. Secretary of State for International Security and Non-Proliferation, Christopher Fort, noted that although companies like Tencent are private in name, in reality they're similar to state-run companies. He added that they cooperate with the regime's intelligence agencies, effectively helping oppress the Chinese people and expand the CCP's global ambitions. Technically, WeChat messages are encrypted between the user and WeChat servers. That means all supposedly private messages first travel through WeChat servers before they're delivered to the other user. A 2016 report by Amnesty International gave Tencent's WeChat, as well as its other Chinese messaging platform QQ, a privacy protection score of 0 out of 100. Tencent did not respond to a request for comment. A paper by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute says one primary issue with WeChat is its extension of censorship beyond China's borders. One example comes from Vancouver. Parliament member Jenny Kwan sent a pro-Hong Kong statement to her constituency through WeChat in 2017, but later the statement was nowhere to be found. Referring to the incident, Human Rights Watch researcher Ya-Chu Wang wrote that the regime quietly and effortlessly prevented a foreign elected official from being heard by her own constituents in their own country. Despite the evidence, the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board declined to comment on its investment in companies involved in human rights abuses. Reporting by Xu Wenhui, NTD News.
The European Union has denounced the CCP's decision to pass national security legislation for Hong Kong. Its leadership is preparing measures to support Hong Kong's autonomy and civil society.
The European Union is preparing countermeasures on China in response to the Chinese Communist Party's new security law in Hong Kong. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen last month warned of very negative consequences for Beijing. But now EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell detailed lighter measures after a meeting of EU foreign ministers in Brussels.
We have agreed today to develop a coordinated European Union response to show support for Hong Kong's autonomy and civil society.
Borrell said nothing had been decided, but that EU foreign ministers had discussed extending the EU's export ban on sensitive technology to Hong Kong. He referred to any equipment or software that could be used for suppressing protests. EU governments could also review their extradition agreements with Hong Kong authorities, review travel advice, increase scholarships for Hong Kong students, and offer more visas to Hong Kongers. Borrell said EU governments could announce national steps separately, but the EU viewed its response as a package to be defined and made reality in the coming days.
The UK government says Huawei must be stripped from the UK's 5G networks by 2027. And from next year, UK mobile providers will be banned from buying new kit from Huawei. Our UK correspondent Jane Wirrell has this report.
Huawei will be phased out from the UK's 5G network, a promise made on Tuesday by the UK's Digital Secretary.
The security and resilience of our telecoms networks is of paramount importance. We have never and will never compromise that security in pursuit of economic prosperity.
The UK's Cybersecurity Centre says owing to US sanctions banning Huawei from using US technology, Huawei's 5G equipment is no longer safe to use. The announcement is a shift from Prime Minister Boris Johnson's decision in January, when he allowed Huawei a limited role in the UK's 5G network.
People have been talking about a U-turn. I think it's been more of a zigzag, and I hope that this is the last zag and the final decision. I think it's the right one.
This was despite pressure from the US to exclude Huawei entirely. The Prime Minister is likely to face pressure from Conservative backbenchers to remove Huawei from its networks even before 2027.
I was listening to the Today programme the other day, and the head of BT said, 7 years, yes, but we can do it in 5. So now let's bring it forward to 5 and make sure it happens quickly.
He's also calling for Huawei to be stripped out from the UK's existing 3G and 4G networks. China's ambassador in London has warned that if the UK bans Huawei, there will be consequences.
It can't be too much worse than, I think, what the Chinese Communist Party has already executed, which is almost a full-scale assault on democratic systems everywhere.
Cross-party politicians are growing more wary of the Chinese state. The UK's chairman of the Commons Defence Select Committee said in Parliament that the UK needs to reset its policy towards Beijing to prepare for repercussions from the Chinese Communist Party. Jane Wirrell, NTD News, London.
The UK chairman of Huawei Technologies and former boss of BP stepped down from his post ahead of the UK government's announcement. A book publisher in Hong Kong is hastily making changes to a draft of a book called To Freedom. He's replacing the word revolution with protests, tweaking a banned slogan and cutting passages that advocate independence for the Chinese-ruled city.
Blue Sticky Notes markware Raymond Yung is reshaping a book called To Freedom. Yung's a Hong Kong publisher, and he spent the last 2 weeks choosing which words and phrases to yank out of this collection of essays. Their authors were participants in the pro-democracy protests that shook this Chinese-ruled city last year. Red lines have struck out the word revolution, any phrases calling for Hong Kong's independence, and a slogan that's been banned. Hong Kong's once unbridled and prolific independent publishers are now censoring themselves in the face of China's new national security law for the city. The law makes the broadly defined crimes of secession, subversion, terrorism, and collusion with foreign forces punishable by up to life in prison. Yung says revising the book has been a painful process.
This part is really about something that is affecting national security, like Hong Kong independence. The only way out, then we feel that this would be too dangerous, so we simply remove this whole part.
Yung says after Beijing first introduced the law, the original printer bailed and 2 other printers turned it away. Another has agreed to take it anonymously, but wants to get a better sense of how the law is implemented first. It comes as organisers of the annual Hong Kong Book Fair, now postponed over the global health crisis, told exhibitors not to display what it called unlawful books without explaining further. Veteran publisher Jimmy Pang has taken part in the fair every year. He believes a book by political cartoonist Zunzi with unflattering caricatures of Chinese leaders could be deemed too sensitive, even though it was published before the law came into effect. Hong Kong authorities say freedom of speech remains intact. But in the past 2 weeks, shops have removed protest-related decorations and slogans, and public libraries have taken some books off the shelves.
Today, we are happy to announce that we've exceeded 500,000 subscribers. The milestone comes despite many of our episodes getting flagged by YouTube. We've made it through the last 5 months in no small part thanks to each and every one of you. All of us here at the China in Focus team want to express our sincere gratitude as we continue to bring you more uncensored reports from China. Thank you for watching and see you tomorrow.